Scary telling.
My grandpa's family lived in Plainfield, Wisconsin, for generations. They were proud of their roots in this small town, but there was always a dark cloud hanging over the community, and that was the infamous grave robber, Ed Gein. My grandpa had always heard stories of the man who had terrorized the town by digging up the bodies of the dead and using their remains for his twisted creations. But it wasn't until years later that my grandpa learned just how close to home the horror had hit. According to my grandpa, some of our relatives had been buried in the cemetery that Ed had frequented. And, as the rumors went, some of those bodies had been dug up by Ed himself. The police never made a public release of the names of those he had disturbed, but my grandpa knew that his family had been affected. Years passed, and my grandpa eventually passed away, leaving the family home to my parents. As a child, I spent many summers in that old house, playing in the fields and exploring the nearby woods. But as I got older, I began to sense that something was not quite right. Strange noises would wake me up in the middle of the night, and I would hear whispers and footsteps coming from the empty rooms. My parents brushed it off as the creaks and groans of an old house, but I knew better. One summer, when I was home from college, I decided to investigate. I went to the cemetery where my grandpa's family was buried, and I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. As I walked through the rows of gravestones, I saw that some of them had been disturbed. The soil was still fresh, and I knew that someone had been digging recently. I started to feel sick to my stomach as I realized that these were the graves of my ancestors and that someone had violated their resting places. As I turned to leave the cemetery, I heard a voice whisper in my ear. It was a cold, dead voice that chilled me to the bone. "Leave now," the voice said, "or suffer the consequences." I ran all the way back to my grandpa's house, and I could feel the presence of something dark and sinister following me. I locked the door behind me, but I could still hear the whispers and footsteps coming from the other side. That night, I had a nightmare that I was walking through the cemetery again. But this time, the graves were open, and the bodies were standing up, staring at me with hollow eyes. I tried to run, but they surrounded me, their cold, clammy hands grabbing at me, pulling me down into the earth. I woke up screaming, and I knew that I had to leave that house. But as I tried to pack my things, I realized that the doors and windows were all locked from the outside. I was trapped, and I could feel the presence of something evil all around me. That's when I saw him. Ed Gein was standing in the corner of the room, his face twisted in a grotesque grin. He beckoned to me with his finger, and I knew that I had no choice but to follow. He led me to the cemetery, where the graves were open once again. But this time, the bodies were not standing up. They were lying down, their limbs twisted at impossible angles, their eyes staring blankly up at the sky. I realized then that Ed was not just a grave robber. He was a necromancer, using his twisted powers to raise the dead and torment the living. And now, I was his latest victim. I tried to run, but I was surrounded on all sides by the undead. They were closing in on me, their cold breath sending shivers down my spine. I screamed for help, but no one came. It was just me and the army of the undead. Suddenly, Ed Gein appeared in front of me, his eyes gleaming with malevolent glee. "This is what happens when you disturb the dead," he said, his voice echoing through the cemetery. I was paralyzed with fear, unable to move as the undead closed in on me. But just as they were about to grab me, there was a blinding flash of light, and they all disappeared. When I opened my eyes, I was back in my grandpa's house, safe and sound. But I knew that I had narrowly escaped a fate worse than death. And as I looked out the window, I could see Ed Gein standing in the fields, watching me with his twisted grin. I knew then that I had to leave Plainfield and never look back. The grave robber's revenge had been unleashed, and I had narrowly escaped with my life. But I knew that there were others who would not be so lucky, and that the terror would continue to haunt the small town for generations to come. When my grandmother was a child, she witnessed something that she could never forget. It was a seance for a little girl who had just tragically died. The entire village had come together to try and contact her spirit. My great-grandmother, who was always skeptical of such things, was also present at the seance. She watched as the villagers chanted and called out to the little girl's spirit, but nothing seemed to happen. In the end, my great-grandmother didn't believe in this sort of thing, so she took the table used in the seance home and placed it by a window. She didn't think much of it until, within an hour, it burst into flames and set her drapes on fire. The fire was put out, and needless to say, the remnants of the table were disposed of. Years later, my family inherited the old house and decided to renovate it. My grandmother had always been fascinated by the story of the haunted table, and she couldn't resist the urge to try and find out more about it. When we arrived at the house, we found it in a state of disrepair. The paint was peeling, and the windows were boarded up. We made our way inside, and it was clear that no one had lived there for a very long time. We started the renovations, and everything was going smoothly until we got to the room where the haunted table had been. We found it covered in dust and cobwebs, but it was still intact. My grandmother couldn't resist the urge to touch it, and as she did, she felt a chill run down her spine. That night, we all went to bed early, exhausted from the long day of renovations. But I couldn't sleep. I kept hearing strange noises coming from the room with the haunted table. It sounded like something was moving around in there, but when I went to investigate, there was nothing there. The next day, strange things started happening all over the house. Doors would open and close on their own, and we could hear footsteps coming from empty rooms. It was clear that the haunted table was still exerting its influence on the house. But things got much worse when my grandmother started having nightmares. She would wake up in the middle of the night, screaming, with scratches on her arms and legs. It was clear that the spirit of the little girl who had died all those years ago was still trapped within the table and was now trying to possess my grandmother. We knew that we had to get rid of the haunted table, but every time we tried to move it, something would happen to stop us. The doors would lock, or the windows would jam shut, and we were trapped inside the house. Finally, we decided to call in a group of paranormal investigators to help us. They arrived at the house armed with cameras and recording equipment, and they started their investigation. It didn't take them long to confirm our suspicions. The table was indeed haunted by the spirit of the little girl who had died all those years ago. They told us that the only way to break the curse was to perform a seance and try to contact the girl's spirit. We gathered around the table, just like the villagers had done all those years ago. We called out to the little girl's spirit, and after a few moments of silence, something strange happened. The table began to shake, and we could feel a cold breeze blowing through the room. Suddenly, we heard a child's voice whispering in our ears, and we knew that the little girl's spirit had finally been set free. The haunted table was still there, but its curse had been broken, and we could finally leave the house without fear. Years later, my family sold the renovated house to a new family, and we never heard of any strange occurrences happening again. But the memory of the haunted table stayed with us for years, and we were always wary of any objects that may have a dark past. In the end, we learned that sometimes the past can come back to haunt us, and that we should always be careful with what we bring into our homes. The haunted table may have been just a piece of furniture, but it had a powerful and terrifying hold over us, one that we will never forget. Growing up, my family never talked much about our ancestry. It wasn't until my mom started digging deep into our family history that we discovered our ties to the infamous White Lady of Dragsholm Slot in Denmark. Her name was Celestine Marianne de Bayonne Gildenstern, and the legend surrounding her was one of the most haunting tales I've ever heard. According to the story, Celestine was the daughter of a nobleman who fell in love with a stable boy. When she became pregnant, her father was outraged and ordered her to be bricked up inside the walls of the house, alive. Her screams echoed through the halls as she pleaded for mercy, but no one came to her aid. After her death, her spirit remained trapped within the walls of Dragsholm Slot, forever haunting the property. Her ghostly figure, draped in a white dress, could be seen wandering the halls and moaning in agony. My mom was excited to discover that we were distantly related to the infamous ghost. We decided to take a trip to Denmark to visit the castle where she had met her tragic end. As we arrived at the castle, a sense of foreboding washed over me. It was a beautiful old building, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. We decided to take a tour of the castle, and as we walked through the halls, I couldn't help but feel like we were being watched. When we reached the room where Celestine had been bricked up, I felt a chill run down my spine. The walls were thick and cold, and I could almost hear her ghostly cries echoing through the air. That night, we stayed in a nearby hotel, but I couldn't sleep. I kept hearing strange noises outside our window, and I knew in my gut that we were in danger. The next day, we returned to the castle for another tour. As we walked through the halls, we could hear strange whispers and moans coming from the walls. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I knew that something was wrong. Suddenly, we heard a blood-curdling scream coming from Celestine's room. We ran towards the sound, but when we got there, we found the door was locked from the inside. We could hear Celestine's ghostly cries coming from within, and I knew that we had to get her out. We searched for a way to open the door, but it was no use. Suddenly, we heard the sound of bricks falling from the wall, and a cold gust of wind blew through the room. The door swung open on its own, and there she was. Celestine's ghostly figure stood before us, dressed in white and glowing with an ethereal light. Her eyes were filled with sadness and pain, and I could feel her anguish radiating through the air. She spoke to us in a voice that was both haunting and beautiful. She told us that her spirit had been trapped within the walls of the castle for centuries, and that she had been waiting for someone to set her free. She begged us to break the curse that had been placed on her family, and to set her spirit free once and for all. We promised to do everything in our power to help her, and she disappeared in a flash of light. From that day forward, my family and I dedicated our lives to breaking the curse that had plagued our family for generations. We discovered that Celestine's father had made a deal with a dark entity, and that he had cursed our family in exchange for power and wealth. But we weren't afraid. With Celestine's help, we were able to break the curse and finally lay her spirit to rest. The castle where she had met her tragic end was transformed into a museum, and people from all over the world came to visit and learn about the history of our family. However, there were still nights when I would wake up in a cold sweat, haunted by the memories of Celestine's ghostly figure and the curse that had plagued our family for so long. I knew that we had broken the curse, but the memory of what we had witnessed would stay with me forever. Years later, as I sat down to write the story of Celestine Marianne, I couldn't help but feel a sense of gratitude towards her. Without her haunting tale, my family and I would never have discovered the curse that had plagued us for so long. But as I looked up from my notebook, I couldn't shake the feeling that Celestine's ghostly figure was still watching me from the shadows, forever trapped within the walls of Drag's home slot. I've always been a skeptic when it comes to the supernatural. Growing up, my family and I never encountered anything that couldn't be explained logically. However, that all changed when I heard my aunt's story about the haunting of Rosalie. My father and my two aunts lived in a house that had been passed down through generations. It was a beautiful old house with a lot of history, but there were rumors that it was haunted. My aunt, who I'll refer to as Kate, was having a sleepover with her friends one night when they decided to play with a Ouija board. As they sat around the board, they asked if there were any spirits present. The planchette began to move on its own, spelling out the name Rosalie. They asked where Rosalie was, and the board spelled out, "On your lap." Suddenly, Kate felt a weight on her lap, as if someone was sitting there. She jumped up, screaming, and her friends were just as terrified. But that was only the beginning. The spirit began to communicate more, spelling out messages on the board. It seemed that Rosalie was a friendly spirit who just wanted to talk. She even asked Kate and her friends to change the channel to 78, saying she liked Elvis. To their amazement, when they turned to channel 78, an Elvis Presley concert was playing. They were all stunned and frightened by the experience, but they didn't think much of it after that night. However, strange things began to happen in the house after the Ouija board incident. Doors would slam shut on their own, footsteps could be heard in empty hallways, and sometimes they could feel a cold breath on the back of their necks. One night, Kate woke up to find the words "I'm still here" written in the condensation on her bedroom window. She tried to rub it off, but it wouldn't budge. She knew then that something was still in the house with them. The activity only got worse from there. Objects would move on their own, and sometimes they could hear whispers in the middle of the night. They started to feel like they were never alone in the house, like there was always something watching them. Eventually, they couldn't take it anymore. They called in a paranormal investigation team to try and rid the house of whatever was haunting them. The team found evidence of a young girl who had died in the house many years ago. They believed it was her spirit that was still there. They tried to perform a cleansing ritual to get rid of the spirit, but it didn't work. In fact, things only got worse after the ritual. The spirit seemed to be more active than ever before. In the end, my family had no choice but to sell the house. They couldn't take the constant fear and unease that came with living there. The house was bought by a family who didn't believe in ghosts, and they never reported any strange activity. But I know the truth. I know that the spirit of Rosalie is still there, waiting for the next unsuspecting person to stumble upon her. And I can only hope that they're prepared for what's to come. As a child, I was always afraid of the dark, so my parents would read me bedtime stories to help me fall asleep. One particular night, my mom came into my room with a brand new book she had just purchased. She sat on the edge of my bed and opened the book, beginning to read the story. But as she started, I felt a sense of déjà vu wash over me. I told my mom that my aunt had already read me that story before. She tried to assure me that it was impossible, since my aunt lived far away in New York City, but I was insistent. As my mom tried to figure out how I could have possibly heard the story before, the phone rang. It was my grandparents, calling to deliver the tragic news that my aunt had just passed away in a car accident. My family was devastated by the news, but as I grew older, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something eerie about the situation. I began to investigate my aunt's life and discovered that she had been an avid book collector, especially of antique children's books. I asked my mom if the book she had read to me that night was one of my aunt's, and she confirmed that it was. It was then that I realized that the book must have been haunted by my aunt's spirit, reaching out to me from beyond the grave. But that wasn't the end of the strange occurrences. Whenever I would pass by the bookshelf where the haunted book was kept, I would feel a chill run down my spine. And every night, I would hear a faint whispering coming from the shelf, almost like someone was reading the book to themselves. One night, I couldn't take it anymore. I approached the bookshelf and reached out to grab the haunted book. But as soon as I touched it, I felt a cold hand wrap around my wrist, pulling me back. I turned around, but there was no one there. That was why I realized that the book was not haunted by my aunt's spirit, but by something much darker and more malevolent. I could feel the evil emanating from its pages, and I knew that I had to get rid of it before it consumed me completely. I took the book outside and threw it into a nearby dumpster, feeling a sense of relief wash over me. But as I turned to walk away, I heard a voice whisper my name from behind me. I spun around, but there was no one there. From that day on, I never went near the dumpster again. And every night, I could still hear the faint whispering coming from the bookshelf in my room. I knew that the book was still out there somewhere, waiting to find its next victim. And I couldn't shake the feeling that it was watching me, waiting for me to slip up so it could claim me as its own.